We have some new developments to share with you in the case of a Wisconsin teenager accused of murdering his parents. He allegedly killed them to, quote, obtain the financial means to assassinate President Donald Trump. This is according to a recently unsealed federal warrant. 17-year-old Nikita Casap allegedly shot and killed his mother and stepfather back in February, then lived with their decomposing bodies as he devised an escape plan. You may remember we covered his first court appearance.
Friday morning, February 28, 2025, Cider Hills Drive, village of Waukesha, Wisconsin. A deputy knocks on a front door and realizes something in the first 3 seconds. This house isn't quiet. It's hiding. Because normal homes make noise. A floor creaks, a faucet runs, a phone buzzes, a dog barks. This one gives nothing. And the call that brought police here isn't even dramatic. It's the most ordinary kind of call a family can make. A welfare check. But the reason behind it is the kind that makes your chest tighten. A teenager stopped going to school for about 2 weeks. Relatives say they haven't heard from the adults in the home in weeks. And every time someone tries to reach them, the silence answers back. Then the door finally opens. And in that moment, everything flips. Because inside, investigators say they find Nikita Casap's mother, Nikita Casap, and his stepfather, Donald Mayer, dead in the house. But the most terrifying part is what's inside. It's what's missing. Nikita Casap is gone. And so is the family's Volkswagen Atlas. Now this isn't just a murder investigation. It's a countdown. Because if the deaths didn't happen that morning, and the teen left before anyone forced the door open, how many days of a head start are we really talking about? And here's the part that turns this case into something viewers can't stop watching. Later that same night, still February 28, 2025, police stopped that missing SUV in WaKeeney, Kansas, hundreds of miles away. Nikita is behind the wheel. So whatever happened in that Wisconsin house didn't just end behind closed doors. It went on the road. And by the end of this story, you'll see how a 2-week silence can hide something unthinkable, and how this case ends in court with a sentence that closes the door forever, while leaving one question that still makes people uncomfortable to say out loud. What was happening inside that home during the days nobody knew? Welcome back, family, and thanks for trusting us. In today's case, we are looking into the Nikita Casap case. The teenager prosecutors say killed his mother, Nikita Casap, and his stepfather, Donald Mayer, and who investigators later linked to a plot narrative involving an attempt to kill President Donald Trump. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Now let us get into it. Friday, February 28, 2025, village of Waukesha, Waukesha County, Wisconsin. Before we go anywhere else, lock this moment into your mind. A deputy standing at a front door on Cider Hills Drive, hearing nothing from the other side, while 2 separate worries collide at the same address. One worry came from family members who said they had not heard from the adults in the home in weeks. The other came from Waukesha West High School, where a teenager named Nikita Casap had stopped showing up for about 2 weeks, even though school officials described him as someone with strong attendance before the silence began. A welfare check is usually the most ordinary call in policing. It often ends with someone waking up late, a phone that was left on silent, a misunderstanding, an awkward apology. But this one felt wrong before anyone even turned the knob. Because the silence wasn't the kind you expect from an empty house. It was the kind that makes you wonder if time itself has been stopped inside. And in this case, that was the fear. Because deputies weren't just trying to locate a teenager who skipped school. They were trying to locate an entire household that had gone dark. Nikita Casap was born September 19, 2007. At the time of the welfare check, he was 17. His mother was Nikita Casap. His stepfather was Donald Mayer. And by the end of that day, February 28, 2025, investigators would say Nikita Casap and Donald Mayer were dead inside the home. But the first hours of this case were not about a courtroom. They were about a door. It's important to understand what happens to your mind when you're watching a welfare check unfold in real time. You start with the hope that it's nothing. Then you move to concern. Then, if the silence continues, you reach that moment where the simplest explanations fall apart. A teen might miss school for a day. 2 days, maybe. But about 2 weeks with no normal contact, no clear confirmation, no real explanation that holds, that changes the temperature. Family members had concerns too. Court documents describe relatives trying to reach the household, and when they couldn't, that concern escalated into law enforcement being called to the address. So on February 28 in the village of Waukesha, deputies arrive, knock, wait, knock again, call out, listen. Nothing. And at some point, the situation crosses the line where law enforcement can no longer treat the door like a boundary that must be respected. They enter. From this point forward, everything changes, because once a home becomes a crime scene, every detail becomes a question. What's in place? What's out of place? What's missing? What looks normal but is? Local reporting later described the home as ransacked, with items emptied from drawers and closets scattered across the floor. Whether that was part of a struggle, part of a search, or part of something else becomes the kind of detail investigators have to weigh carefully, because messy scenes can mislead. What was not misleading was what deputies found. Nikita Casap and Donald Mayer were dead inside the residence. And then comes the detail that turns a tragedy inside one house into a moving emergency. Nikita Casap is not there. The teenager the school is worried about, the teenager the family is worried about, the teenager law enforcement expected to find in the home is gone. Now investigators have 2 possibilities in front of them, and both are terrifying. Either Nikita is a missing teenager in danger, and he needs to be found fast, or Nikita is the person who needs to be found because he is fleeing. At that moment on February 28, 2025, in Waukesha County, Wisconsin, investigators do not have the ending yet. All they have is the beginning, and the beginning is a question that feels like a countdown. If the adults in this house are dead, and the teen is gone, when did he leave, and how far could he already be? Because if the deaths did not happen that day, and the absence from school suggests the household's routine broke earlier, then the timeline is not measured in hours. It is measured in days. And days of head start is what makes a case like this feel impossible at first, because a head start is not only distance. It is time to hide evidence, time to plan, time to create stories, time to disappear into highways and gas stations and states where nobody knows your face. This is why, early on, vehicles matter. Not because a car is glamorous, because a car is a moving timeline. In this case, investigators quickly focused on a Volkswagen Atlas connected to Donald Mayer. Court records and reporting identify it as the vehicle that was missing from the household and later found with Nikita. And this is where the map opens up. Because now, this story is no longer contained inside a home in Wisconsin. Now it becomes a trail. And that trail snaps into focus the same night the bodies are discovered. Friday night, February 28, 2025, WaKeeney, Kansas, near Interstate 70. At approximately 11:25 p.m., the WaKeeney Police Department performs a traffic stop on the Volkswagen Atlas. Court documents place that traffic stop at about 11:25 p.m., and local reporting aligns with that same time and location. This is the moment that turns the public story into something people can't stop watching because the contrast is brutal. Back in Waukesha County, Wisconsin, earlier that day, deputies are forcing entry into a home for a welfare check because no one has been heard from in weeks. And now, hundreds of miles away in Kansas, police are looking at the missing vehicle and the person behind the wheel. It is Nikita Casap, and the family dog is in the vehicle with him. You can feel the audience reaction to that detail every time this case is discussed, because the dog detail makes it real. It tells you this wasn't just someone running in panic with nothing. This was someone moving with possession, with control, with a sense of time. And then, according to the criminal complaint and reporting, officers observe a firearm in the vehicle in plain view, later identified as a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. Court documents also describe finding identification items belonging to the victims, ammunition, and spent shell casings. That is not the kind of discovery that leaves law enforcement treating you like a kid who ran away. That is discovery that makes investigators think about motive, planning, and what happened back home. So the traffic stop becomes more than an arrest, it becomes a pivot. From this point forward, the case becomes a reverse reconstruction. Investigators now have the ending of the first act. Nikita is in custody in Kansas on February 28, 2025. Now they have to rebuild what happened before the welfare check. Now they have to turn the 2-week absence into a timeline with dates and actions and evidence. Because in true crime, the most disturbing part is not always the violence. Sometimes the most disturbing part is what happens after, when life continues around something that should have stopped everything. And that is exactly why this case ignited such intense public attention. Because prosecutors later argued that the bodies had been in the home for more than 2 weeks before discovery. That means there was a stretch of time where the outside world was still doing normal things: school days, work days, groceries, morning routines, while the inside of that house was something else entirely. It is difficult to describe that without your mind trying to protect you from it. So instead, think about what that implies for the investigation. If the bodies were not discovered for more than 2 weeks, then investigators have to answer questions like: what did Nikita tell anyone who asked where he was? What did he tell anyone who asked about his parents? Did he communicate with friends, with school, with family? Did he send messages that felt normal? Did he try to create a reason for the absence? Court documents and reporting describe the school receiving an email about him being sick, and the prolonged absence being one of the major triggers for the welfare check request. And once investigators have a suspect in custody, the evidence building begins in layers. First layer, the timeline of when the deaths likely occurred. Second layer, the movement of the vehicle and the route out of Wisconsin. Third layer, what was taken, what was left behind, what was used, and what was found in the vehicle. Fourth layer, motive. Because motive is what people argue about long after the facts are in. And in this case, motive became one of the most controversial and headline-driving parts of the story. As the case moved forward, news coverage described allegations that Casap killed his parents and stole money in connection with what authorities portrayed as a plot narrative involving an attempt to kill President Donald Trump. Specifically, that prosecutors tied the motive to funding such a plan. This is reporting language, and it matters to say it that way, because a responsible documentary separates what is proven in court from what is alleged as motive in charging narratives and media reporting. But right now, at this point in the story, we are still in the early days of the case. We are still on February 28, 2025. We are still in the split-screen reality of this investigation. Waukesha County, Wisconsin, a home that just became a crime scene. WaKeeney, Kansas, a traffic stop that just turned into a major arrest. And the public is only beginning to understand the shape of the nightmare. Because when a teen is stopped out of state on the same day his parents are found dead, the story instantly becomes larger than a local headline. It becomes a question people can't stop asking. How did it get here? How does a teenager go from missing school to being stopped hundreds of miles away in a vehicle tied to his stepfather? What happened inside the home first? And what happened after? The case begins moving through the system. Initial appearances, charges, court dates, and the slow grinding process of building a prosecutable narrative around what investigators believe occurred. That system can feel slow to the public, but behind the scenes, it moves fast in a different way. Search warrants, digital evidence, camera footage, financial records, neighbors, school records. Every strand gets pulled. And one of the reasons this case holds attention is that it has a built-in structure that mirrors a thriller. There is the silent opening, the welfare check, the discovery, the missing teen, the missing vehicle, the interstate stop, the evidence in the vehicle. And then, as the public begins to learn more, there is the darker layer, the time gap. The days where something inside the house didn't match the world outside. This is the exact point where viewers lean forward, because they realize the case is not only about what happened in one moment. It is about what happened across a stretch of time, and what someone was willing to do in that stretch. By the time the case reaches 2026, the courtroom ending becomes a major part of how people process it. On Thursday, January 8, 2026, Casap pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in Waukesha County Circuit Court, in connection with the deaths of Nikita Casap and Donald Mayer. As part of that plea deal, prosecutors dismissed other charges. Multiple reports say 7 other charges were dropped, including 2 counts described as hiding a corpse and theft. Then, on Thursday, March 5, 2026, he was sentenced to life in prison. Reporting from Wisconsin outlets and AP syndicated coverage described the judge imposing life terms without the possibility of release. But those are end-stage facts. This chapter is not the ending. This chapter is the opening trap. Because the part of the story that keeps people watching is not the sentence. It is the gap. The question that hangs over everything like a shadow. If the welfare check happened on February 28, 2025, and investigators say the deaths occurred earlier, what happened in the days in between? Who noticed first? What was said? What was done? What was hidden? And here is the last thing you need to understand before we go into the next chapter. A case like this is built on what investigators call ordinary proof. Not a single dramatic clue. Not one magical confession that solves everything in an instant. It is built on dozens of small facts that stack until they become a wall. A school absence, a family concern, a welfare check, a silent door, a missing vehicle, a traffic stop in Kansas at about 11:25 p.m., a gun in plain view, identification belonging to the victims, and a teenager behind the wheel with the family dog beside him. These are the facts that started the machine. Now the investigation does what it always does after a scene like this. It stops guessing and starts building a calendar. Because February 28, 2025 is only the day the door finally opened in the village of Waukesha. The harder question is what prosecutors later alleged happened before that day, and how the pieces lined up so tightly that the case didn't stay in the missing teen category for long. According to prosecutors, the deaths of Nikita Casap and Donald Mayer happened on or about Tuesday, February 11, 2025, inside that home in Waukesha County, Wisconsin. That date matters because it changes what 2 weeks really means. It means the school absence isn't just a random disappearance. It becomes part of a timeline that starts right after the alleged homicide date. So investigators lean into the first place where time is recorded without emotion: school attendance. Waukesha West High School notices Nikita Casap isn't showing up. The absence stretches. It isn't one day. It isn't a weekend. It becomes a pattern long enough that school involvement becomes one of the triggers for the welfare check request on February 28. And while that's happening, family members are also trying to reach the adults in the home. When they can't, the concern escalates to law enforcement. This is the part of the case people underestimate. Everyone focuses on the crime scene, but the case starts getting solved in the quiet places. Attendance records, missed calls, unanswered messages, the normal systems that detect when a human life suddenly stops behaving like a human life. Then investigators start asking the next question. If Nikita was still moving around after February 11, what did he use to move? And that's where the Volkswagen Atlas becomes more than a vehicle. It becomes a timeline on wheels. In court filings, investigators describe how they used neighborhood footage to track that SUV's movement around the days leading up to the welfare check. One neighbor's Ring camera captures the Atlas moving multiple times on Sunday, February 23, 2025, in the neighborhood near the Waukesha home. That detail does two things. First, it supports the idea that someone was still actively using the vehicle days after prosecutors say the deaths occurred. Second, it shows behavior that looks controlled, moving the car, repositioning it, then eventually disappearing with it entirely. And once that SUV disappears, the story leaves Wisconsin. Investigators then reconstruct the trip using what they can verify: travel indicators, records, and the end point where police finally stop the vehicle. Late Friday night, February 28, 2025, WaKeeney, Kansas, near Interstate 70, officers stopped the Volkswagen Atlas at approximately 11:25 p.m. The driver is Nikita Casap, and the family dog is in the vehicle. That traffic stop becomes one of the most important clean facts in the entire case because it is time-stamped, documented, and consistent across reporting and court paperwork. Then comes the evidence that shifts the tone from teen on the run to major felony case. According to the criminal complaint, officers observed a gun in plain view on the passenger side floorboard. It was later identified as a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. And the complaint describes officers finding identification linked to the victims, along with ammunition and spent shell casings. This is the moment investigators stop treating the vehicle like transportation and start treating it like a moving evidence locker. Now the focus snaps back to Waukesha County, not to repeat what was found inside the home, but to understand the strategy that prosecutors later described. Because from the state's perspective, the case was not only what happened on February 11. It was what happened between February 11 and February 28. And that period becomes the most disturbing part of the narrative. Prosecutors later alleged that the bodies were in the home long enough to decompose severely before being discovered. That single allegation changes how the public hears every other detail. It changes how you interpret the school absence. It changes how you interpret the silence from family. And it changes how you interpret the February 23 vehicle movement. Because now the question becomes direct and brutal. If prosecutors are right about the timeline, how did life continue in that house long enough for the outside world to only notice through missed school days and unanswered calls? Now here's where a lot of documentaries get boring. They start listing charges. We're not doing that. We're tracking momentum. The first public-facing charges weren't immediately the 2 homicide counts. Early on, reporting notes that Casap was initially charged with felonies connected to the vehicle and firearm situation before homicide charges were filed later. That detail matters because it shows how prosecutors often work when they have a suspect in custody, but still need to lock down forensic timelines and evidence processing before the most serious charges. It's a step-by-step squeeze. Hold the suspect. Secure the vehicle. Process the scene. Build the timeline. Then file the charges that stick. As the case progressed, the story gained national attention because investigators and prosecutors described a motive narrative that wasn't limited to the household. Multiple outlets later framed the case as prosecutors alleging Casap killed his mother, Nikita Casap, and stepfather, Donald Mayer, in order to obtain resources tied to a plot narrative involving Donald Trump. That allegation is one of the biggest reasons this case became click-worthy beyond Wisconsin. It moved the story from a family homicide case into a national headline about motive and extremism claims. But inside the courtroom, the process remained the same: evidence first, then outcomes. On Thursday, January 8, 2026, in Waukesha County Circuit Court in Waukesha, Wisconsin, Casap pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. And prosecutors said that as part of the plea deal, they dropped 7 other charges, including 2 counts of hiding a corpse and theft. That plea deal detail is a retention weapon if you handle it right, because viewers always ask the same question: why drop anything in a case this serious? The answer is simple, and it's always the same. Prosecutors trade breadth for certainty. They don't need 10 charges if 2 convictions guarantee life. And that brings the case to the final courtroom moment. Thursday, March 5, 2026, Waukesha County Circuit Court, Waukesha, Wisconsin. Casap is sentenced to life in prison. But here's what you should not miss. The sentence closes the case legally, but the story viewers stay for is still the same question that started everything. What happened in that gap? What exactly did investigators learn about the days after February 11, 2025, that made the timeline so disturbing? Because a welfare check doesn't become a national headline unless the silence has a shape. And in this case, that shape is made of specific dates. February 11, 2025, the date prosecutors pointed to for the killings. February 23, 2025, the vehicle still moving in the neighborhood. February 28, 2025, the door opens in Waukesha, and the same night the vehicle is stopped in WaKeeney, Kansas at about 11:25 p.m. January 8, 2026, the guilty plea in Waukesha County Circuit Court. March 5, 2026, the life sentence. Investigators built it in 3 straight lines. First, the school line. Waukesha West High School's records showed Nikita stopped showing up, and the absence stretched long enough that the school pushed for a welfare check. That wasn't drama. That was a documented pattern that anchored the 2-week silence to real dates. Second, the neighborhood line. A neighbor's doorbell camera captured the Volkswagen Atlas moving on February 23, 2025. That matters because it shows activity at the house days after prosecutors later pointed to February 11, 2025 as the homicide date. It helped investigators argue the home wasn't abandoned right away. It was being managed. Third, the travel line. Once the Atlas vanished, investigators followed the route using records that don't lie: fuel stops, card activity, and the final hard timestamp. The traffic stop in WaKeeney, Kansas late on February 28, 2025. From there, the vehicle became a rolling evidence box: a gun in view, victim-linked identification, and other items noted in court filings. Then the legal strategy becomes simple. Prosecutors didn't need 10 dramatic moments. They needed 2 convictions that end the case permanently. So by January 8, 2026, in Waukesha County Circuit Court, Nikita Casap pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, and other charges were dropped as part of the deal. And on March 5, 2026, the judge delivered the only remaining decision that mattered: life in prison, no release. That's the court ending. But the story ending, the part that keeps people watching, is still the same question that started the case. If the truth was already inside that house, why did it take the outside world 2 weeks to force the door open? After the arrest and the evidence trail, the case didn't stay only about what happened inside that house in Waukesha County. As the court process moved forward, prosecutors and national coverage described an alleged motive narrative that pushed this into a much bigger headline. That Nikita Casap killed Tatiana Casap and Donald Mayer to get resources connected to a plot narrative involving Donald Trump. That wording matters, because a responsible documentary doesn't treat motive claims like proven facts just because they are explosive. It treats them the way the justice system treats them, as what prosecutors alleged and argued based on what they said they found in the investigation and what they believed it meant. And that's the point where this case became 2 stories at the same time. Story 1 is the one the courtroom can lock down cleanly. A teen, a home in Waukesha County, 2 deaths, a vehicle leaving the state, a traffic stop in WaKeeney, Kansas on February 28, 2025, and a legal endpoint that lands on January 8, 2026 for the guilty plea and March 5, 2026 for the life sentence. Story 2 is the question the public can't stop replaying. What was happening during the days when the house stayed closed, the school kept marking absences, and family members kept getting silence back? Because the most disturbing part of this case isn't only the ending. It's the gap. It's the idea that a normal system was still running outside that house, while something irreversible had already happened inside it. And that's why this case triggers such a strong reaction. Not because it's complicated, because it's simple enough to feel possible. A missed routine, a closed door, a few days that become too many days, and then the moment someone finally says, "We're not waiting anymore." So the last question is whether the court finished the paperwork. The last question is what this case really shows about danger. Was it money? Was it ideology? Was it control? Or was it something even more basic? A decision made in private that the outside world didn't detect until the calendar forced the truth into the open. Now, before we close, I want you to answer this in the comments, because the comment section on cases like this becomes the real courtroom for public logic. What do you think was the real driver here? Ideology, money, fear, or something else? And if you're still watching right now, you're the kind of person this channel is made for. Thank you for watching. If you want more cases told straight, clear, and step-by-step, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and tell us where you're watching from, because the next case is already moving.